For many florists, 30 to 50% of an entire year's revenue happens in roughly three short windows: Valentine's Day, Mother's Day, and the Christmas and Hanukkah season. Get those few weeks right, order the right volume, staff up correctly, price ahead of the wholesale spike, and you've largely made your year. Get them wrong, and no amount of steady business the other 11 months can fully make up the difference. Before you open a flower shop, here's what nobody tells you. This isn't a business with steady, predictable weekly demand you can smooth out with good customer service. It's a business built around a handful of make-or-break weekends, wrapped around a product that starts dying the moment you buy it. By the time this is over, you're going to understand exactly why those two facts, together, decide almost everything about whether a flower shop actually survives. We need to talk about what a flower shop actually is before we talk about money. Because the pretty storefront hides two genuinely brutal operational realities most people never think about before opening one. The first is that your core product is perishable in a way most retail inventory simply isn't. Fresh flowers typically only make sense to hold for 3 to 5 days before quality drops enough to affect what you can charge for them. There's no marking them down and selling them next month. The second is that demand for this product isn't evenly spread across the year. It's concentrated into a small number of dramatic spikes tied to specific calendar dates that don't move. Put those two things together, and you get a business where just order a bit extra to be safe is exactly the mistake that sinks a lot of new owners. Over-ordering in the first few months, before you've learned your real local demand, commonly leads to spoilage waste eating well over 30% of what was purchased, directly out of your margin. Here is where the range depends heavily on which version of this business you're actually building, and it's one of the widest ranges in this entire series relative to how different the underlying operations are. At the very lean end, a minimal home-based setup, basic cooler, hand tools, initial supplies, can launch for as little as $1,500 to $2,500, focused on direct sales through social media and word of mouth rather than a physical storefront. A more complete home-based or wedding-focused operation, real refrigeration, a proper supply relationship with wholesalers typically runs closer to $10,000 to $25,000. A full retail storefront, the kind with walk-in traffic, a display cooler, and genuine street presence, commonly requires $60,000 to $220,000, with refrigeration and cooler equipment alone, sometimes running close to $10,000 of that total. Here's the part that catches almost every first-time owner off guard. The storefront lease and the cooler are not your biggest ongoing risk. It's the cash reserve you need sitting in the bank to survive the deep seasonal trough between your holiday peaks. A shop pulling in $15,000 in a strong June can realistically drop to $4,000 in a slow January, and owners who spend their summer revenue as if it were steady income, instead of setting aside 3 to 4 months of reserves for the off-season, are disproportionately the ones who close in year 2. So you've got your cooler stocked, your supplier relationships built, and technically, you're now running a flower shop. Congratulations. Before your first bouquet sells, you have a set of problems that a normal retail business simply doesn't have. The very first problem is that your wholesale costs spike violently in exactly the weeks you need product the most. Rose prices around Valentine's Day can climb 200 to 400% above normal wholesale pricing, and Mother's Day pushes most flower categories up 50 to 150%. A shop that doesn't raise retail prices proportionally during those weeks, keeping the same markup structure they use the rest of the year, can watch their margin get quietly crushed during their single most important sales period. The second problem is wire services. If you rely on them for volume, national order networks connect you to customers ordering from other cities, which sounds like free growth, but these networks typically take 20 to 30% of the order value as a fee, on top of a monthly membership cost. On a $75 arrangement, that can leave genuinely thin margin left over once flowers, labor, and delivery are covered, sometimes as little as a few dollars of real profit on an order that looked substantial on paper. The third problem is that wedding and event work, often the highest margin category in this business, requires real pricing discipline to actually be profitable. A small wedding booked without a proper minimum can lose money entirely once consultation time, design, sourcing, prep, transport, setup, and breakdown are all accounted for, which is exactly why most florists now set real wedding minimums rather than accepting every inquiry that comes in. The fourth problem is that subscription and recurring bouquet models, appealing because they promise predictable income, are easy to underprice. A weekly bouquet subscription priced too close to what a single walk-in arrangement costs can quietly lose money once sourcing, delivery, the vase, and labor are all factored in against a lower recurring price point. Let's say you've solved the big problems. Now let's talk about what it costs every month in a business where revenue itself swings dramatically depending on the calendar. Fixed monthly operating costs for a flower shop typically range from around $6,000 to $12,500. Rent alone commonly running $2,000 to $5,000 or more depending on location, with utilities for refrigeration and climate control adding another $500 to $1,000 on top. Staff costs typically run 30 to 40% of your operating budget, even before the temporary seasonal help you'll need layered on top during your peak weeks. And this is the part that quietly separates thriving flower shops from struggling ones. Those fixed costs don't shrink during your slow months, which means a shop's survival often comes down to whether it treated its holiday windows as the primary profit engine funding the rest of the year, or simply as a few busy weeks among many, a mindset difference that shows up directly in how much cash is actually sitting in reserve come January. Here is where the flower shop business gets genuinely interesting, because almost every other business in this series has revenue spread across the calendar in some reasonably predictable shape. This one doesn't, and pretending otherwise is exactly what sinks new owners. Holiday concentration, 30 to 50% of annual revenue landing inside roughly 3 narrow calendar windows, means a flower shop isn't really 12 months of steady business. It's closer to 3 or 4 extremely high-stakes events, surrounded by long stretches of quieter, thinner margin, day-to-day sales that mostly exist to cover fixed costs and keep the lights on between the events that actually build the year's profit. Here's the number that changes everything. A shop that nails its Valentine's Day and Mother's Day purchasing, staffing, and pricing, ordering enough stock to avoid a stockout, but not so much that spoilage eats the upside, can post a genuinely strong year, even with an otherwise unremarkable January through March. A shop that gets those same few weeks wrong, whether through under-ordering and missing sales, or over-ordering and eating spoilage, can post a weak year even with perfectly solid performance every other week on the calendar. The entire business, in a very real sense, gets decided in about 3 weekends a year, and everything else is largely there to survive the gaps between them. There are really 2 types of people who end up running flower shops, and their businesses look almost nothing alike by the second year. The first is the volume and network operator, someone leaning heavily on wire service memberships for order volume, especially in the early months while building a local reputation. This owner gets faster access to order flow and less dependency on slow-building organic followers, but is giving up 20 to 30% of every wire order's value to do it, a real structural tax on margin that never goes away as long as they stay dependent on that channel. The second is the direct relationship builder, someone investing early in a genuine local following, social media, wedding vendor relationships, referral networks, to generate direct orders at full margin instead of paying a wire service cut. This owner's early growth is typically slower. Building a meaningful local audience commonly takes 6 to 12 months, but their margin on every order they do land is meaningfully stronger once that audience exists. Let's run the numbers on a small retail storefront, opened for $40,000. Talking about the optimistic scenario, the shop builds a real cash reserve going into its first winter, treats Valentine's Day and Mother's Day purchasing with real discipline, raising prices proportionally to match wholesale spikes rather than eating the increase, and lands 8 weddings a month by month 12 through a growing local network. Combined with steady walk-in and subscription revenue, annual revenue reaches roughly $200,000. With disciplined seasonal buying keeping spoilage well controlled, net margin lands around 18%, netting around $36,000, and the $40,000 investment is on track to pay back within a reasonable multi-year window. Talking about the realistic scenario, the shop opens with genuine enthusiasm, but underestimates the winter trough, spending its strong early summer revenue as if it were steady income. It overorders ahead of its first Valentine's Day, uncertain of real local demand, and eats significant spoilage waste when a meaningful share of that inventory doesn't sell in time. January and February revenue drops sharply with no reserve built to cushion it, forcing the owner to delay a supplier payment and strain the relationship that keeps wholesale pricing competitive. Annual revenue lands lower, around $140,000, and net margin, dragged down by the spoilage loss and the cash flow strain, falls to around 6%. The difference between those two outcomes isn't the quality of the arrangements. It's whether the business was built with genuine respect for how concentrated and how unforgiving this industry's calendar actually is. Owning a flower shop is not a steady, evenly paced retail business that happens to sell something beautiful. It's a business built around a small number of enormous, unmovable calendar events, wrapped around a product that starts losing value the moment you buy it, where the difference between a strong year and a weak one is frequently decided in about 3 weekends. The $1,500 home-based starter setup and the $220,000 full retail storefront are the same business wearing different clothes. A bet that you can navigate a handful of unforgiving purchasing and pricing decisions each year well enough to fund the quieter months in between, before spoilage, a missed price adjustment, or an empty winter cash reserve, makes that decision for you instead. For the owner who respects the calendar as the real engine of this business, not a backdrop to it, a flower shop can be one of the more genuinely rewarding small businesses in this series. For the owner who treats every month as roughly the same, it's an expensive way to discover that 3 weekends were always going to decide the whole year, whether the business was ready for them or not.